Welcome to Working for Women, the Independent Women's Forum podcast, where we are changing the conversation about women and public policy for the better.
Hello, I'm Heather Madden, Director of Operations and Policy Research at Independent Women's Forum, and your host for today's Working for Women podcast. Today, I'm here with Hadley Heath Manning, Director of Policy at Independent Women's Forum. Today, we're going to be discussing tax reform and how it would impact women and their families. Hadley, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Heather.
You know, Hadley, our tax code hasn't reformed since 1986, but it's certainly grown since that time. In fact, our tax code has changed almost 5,000 times from 2001 to 2012, which is an average of once every day. Today, the tax code consists of about 2,650 pages, but then there's also about 70,000 additional forms and guidance. So can you talk about how this has impacted Americans' ability to simply comply with the tax code when filing their taxes each year?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, we're talking about tax reform, and I feel like this is an issue that's kind of hard to capture the public's imagination. Like, no one likes talking about taxes, right? It's not a very sexy topic, and no one likes thinking about doing their taxes either. Like, it's such a drain every year, but we do spend a lot of time thinking about our taxes. We spend a lot of time filing our tax paperwork, and I think the average American devotes about 27 and a half hours to preparing his individual income tax return, which is crazy if you think about it. That's like a part-time work week for one work a year. And that means that the cost to our economy in terms of just navigating the tax code is about $409 billion each year, according to the Tax Foundation. So, you know, people are spending their time. A lot of people are hiring tax preparers and paying them, or they're buying software each year to try to update and keep up with all those changes that you mentioned. But that's just a huge opportunity cost. That's money that we could be spending. That's time that we could be spending on truly productive activities. Obviously, for businesses, having more time and more money means they could hire more workers. They could invest more in their businesses. They could raise wages, for crying out loud. They could lower their prices or something. But instead, we waste really enormous amounts of time and money just trying to comply. And that's aside from, you know, the money that we actually pay in taxes. So I can understand why people are frustrated by this. I think the frustration is really seasonal. You know, I think if we were talking about this in, you know, late March, early April, there'd be a lot of people who are just filing their taxes, or, you know, a lot of people file just on January 1st. So, but here we are, you know, talking about it in September because Congress is about to address this issue. But I think when people really think about the time that they spend and how frustrating it is. And just like there's a psychological effect to this too. When the tax code is so hard to comply with, people aren't sure if they're doing it right. And people want to know that they're doing this right. You know, people want to have confidence that they're not breaking the law by missing something, you know, not reporting something correctly on their tax return. So that's sort of what I think is the impact on Americans. It's psychological, but it's mainly an economic, you know, huge waste and huge opportunity cost.
Yeah, and I think most people, you know, would agree that it shouldn't be so difficult to follow the law. And, you know, most people, you know, they want to, you know, do the right thing. They want to be law-abiding citizens. And so, you know, they don't want to, you know, be concerned about being penalized if they were audited by the IRS. So that's a really great point. You know, I would love to hear a little bit more about the different plans out there for reforming the tax code. You know, specifically right now, there's a lot of attention on President Trump's intended tax overhaul. So can you tell us a little bit about what's in that plan and how it would affect everyday Americans?
Right. I think it's, you know, this the plan will go through several rounds, I'm sure, of negotiations in Congress. So it's hard to say now what the final details of the plan will be, but the president has offered sort of an outline. And one very important aspect to his plan is that it actually doubles the standard deduction. Today, the standard deduction is $6,300 for individual filers and $12,600 for married filers. And I'm sure, as people know, standard deduction is what you can take away from your taxable income before you pay income taxes. And so the Trump plan would actually more than double the standard deduction. It would be $15,000 for single filers and $30,000 for married filers. And this means huge tax relief, to use one of the president's favorite words, huge. It's going to be huge. But $15,000 for an individual filer, I mean, if you think about that, The federal minimum wage in the United States is $7.25 an hour. If you work full-time, meaning 40 hours a week, at $7.25 an hour in the course of 1 year, you're going to make about $15,000. And so that means that your entire income would be subject to the standard deduction. That means people would, be able to shield their income from taxation. And for people who earn more than that, of course, the increase in the standard deduction just means they'd be shielding more of their money from income tax. So I think that's one very important facet to the plan. He would also decrease the number of tax brackets, and this sort of falls under the simplification banner. Today we have like 7 different tax brackets, and his plan would have 3. And that would also kind of flatten the tax code a little bit, which means sort of distribute more fairly what different people are paying. And finally, his plan would include some eliminations to the deductions and loopholes that many people use. Obviously, he wouldn't eliminate the standard deduction. He's increasing it by more than 2 times. But he would eliminate a lot of deductions and loopholes that contribute to the pages and pages and pages of the tax code that you mentioned earlier. He would keep in place the deduction for your mortgage and for gifts to charitable organizations. But a lot of the other things that people have to keep track of and that people have to put on their tax return, trying to deduct from their taxable income, those things would go away. And the idea being, of course, that if you have a lower tax rate and you don't have to keep up with as many tax deductions and you don't have to go looking for, the loopholes that are in the tax code, that you come out better because compliance is easier, and it creates fewer economic distortions. Because, of course, if you provide a tax deduction for a particular activity or behavior, then that's going to encourage people to do that activity. And our tax code shouldn't really be in the business of rewarding certain people over other people based on, what the tax code says is better behavior or worse behavior. The tax code should be sort of neutral to our economic activity. So I think all these things sort of would result in, a smaller tax compliance burden, certainly, and then just a smaller tax payment burden, which I think everybody likes more money in our pockets, right? And so one study has suggested that middle-class families would save about $1,000 a year with the Trump tax plan. So I think a lot of these, changes would be welcome. And then one other thing I wanted to mention, Heather, just because we are Independent Women's Forum and we do talk a lot about women and families, and the Trump plan, as Ivanka Trump has spelled out, includes a few changes that are particularly helpful to parents. And so I'll just mention those. There's going to be a new deduction for child and dependent care expenses, and a new type of tax-free savings account for child and dependent care expenses, and an increase in the earned income tax credit for working parents. And so all of these things, bottom line with those is that if you're a working parent, no matter what your income level, you can benefit from one of these changes. And I think that's a wise way to tackle the problem of very expensive child rearing in today's society. And I think that's something that, all working families can celebrate.
Absolutely. I think everyone wins when you can create new jobs and increase wages. And, that last part you talked about, helping parents, that's a win for everyone, not just those at the top. And so that kind of leads me to my next question, Hadley. I think a lot of people are interested in what's going to happen to the corporate tax rate here in the United States. The current corporate tax rate of 35% is among the highest in the world here. Can you tell us about how this high rate impacts both businesses and workers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when people think of the corporate tax rate, or really anything with the word corporate in it, which I think has sort of become like a villainized word. If it's corporate, it must be, in a smoky room with people smoking cigars and up to no good, trying to take advantage of the little guy. And that's not really right when it comes to the corporate tax code. Corporate tax impacts everyone. It impacts, obviously, investors and shareholders and people who are in the C-suite, people who are, at the upper levels of management in corporations, but it also affects workers. And that rate that you mentioned, 35%, it's a federal corporate tax rate. And remember, a lot of American businesses face additional corporate taxes at the state level. So you're right, we do have the highest statutory corporate tax rate in the world, which makes it hard for us to compete with other countries in terms of, competing for business. But then we also have some of the highest effective corporate tax rates in the world. Because I know sometimes people will hear, oh, we might have a high statutory, corporate tax rate, but businesses don't actually pay that much because all the loopholes. But the reality is when you measure the effective tax rates, actually, yes, American businesses do pay a lot in taxes. And what does that mean? That means American workers indirectly pay a lot in corporate taxes. It's hard to say the exact percentage, but the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation make the baseline assumption that workers indirectly pay 25% of all corporate tax dollars. Other economists estimate that percentage to be even higher, meaning that more than $1 in every $4 that gets paid in corporate taxes is indirectly coming from workers. That means they're missing out on wage increases. They're missing out on more benefits. They're missing out on more economic opportunity in the workplace. And so, if you want to talk about what a lower corporate tax rate would mean, well, it's going to be associated with higher wages, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it's going to be associated with more economic opportunities as more businesses decide to, headquarter in the United States, do business in the United States, hire American workers, and pay them more because that money is no longer being sucked up by a very high corporate tax rate.
It seems like a lot of these reforms that we've been talking about have the potential to affect women in particular. And this is, of course, something we're very interested in as Independent Women's Forum. Women currently comprise 47% of the U.S. workforce. More women are breadwinners now than ever before, and women-owned businesses are on the rise. So do you think tax policy is a women's issue?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't know how other people's families work, but I feel like I'm the household financial manager, even though I'm married and I have a child. I think a lot of women and moms do that for their families. So we're acutely aware of where every dollar is going. We do a lot of the consumer decisions. We decide, what kind of groceries we're going to buy and what kind of cars we're going to buy. And we even, more so than ever, women are buying houses. Women are participating in the economy, have huge economic power compared to our predecessors. You mentioned women as business owners. Just look at the way the Uberized economy has given women more opportunities than ever to find, what we might call work-life balance. Look at Etsy. Look at how many people have an Etsy shop. Look at how many women are taking advantage of technology and taking advantage of the opportunities to work part-time or work from home and really design their own economic opportunities, work for themselves. I mean, this is an era of unprecedented opportunity for women, and that's good news. But that means that, yes, tax policy is more so now than ever a women's issue, and that women are thinking about, how much money they're paying in taxes. A lot of women are paying both sides of payroll taxes because they're paying as employers and employees. They're thinking about the way tax policy influences their decisions about their mortgages, and they're thinking about their childcare expenses. They're thinking about, all the ways that these things are sort of working together to provide either greater social mobility, the ability to sort of save and move up that ladder and provide a better life for our children, or our policies are, today I'd argue that they may be restricting those opportunities by making it very difficult for families to get by. And so I think you're absolutely right that women as employees, as employers, as participants in the gig economy, we're definitely paying attention to this, and it's going to have a huge impact on us.
Here's a final question I have, Hadley. September is a key month for policymakers. We talked about this a little bit at the start of the podcast. The legislative schedule is packed with a tall list of must-pass items. This, of course, includes comprehensive tax reform, but also repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act and voting on a debt-filling bill. So how can the President and Congress come together and get this done?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the final details of a tax plan are hard to say because there will be some negotiating going on. There will be some back and forth, not necessarily between Democrats and Republicans, but as we saw with health reform, sometimes within the Republican caucus, there's some disagreement and there's going to be some challenges. So I don't think this is going to be easy. You mentioned, sort of a laundry list of items that Congress is hoping to address. And there are a lot of issues addressing the country. But the good news is for the president and for Congress that some of these tax policy changes that they're considering, whether it's reducing the number of brackets, lowering rates on working families, getting rid of deductions and loopholes that unnecessarily complicate the tax code, have broad public support. I mean, they have support across the political spectrum. So I don't think that this needs to be as partisan of a debate as it's probably going to be. But I hope that the president and members of Congress keep in mind what's good for American families and what's good for the American economy broadly. And I think if they do that, then they can get some really positive changes made that will impact our economy right away. I mean, really jumpstart the economy, but also have long-term effects, allowing more and more families to keep more of their own hard-earned dollars, to move out of poverty and even to move out of the middle class into the upper class, but just to have people continually improving their lives through having a more straightforward tax code. The tax code, like I said at the beginning, it is not a sexy topic, but it's one that touches our lives in so many ways. I would say, maybe the only other policy area that's more boring and also of equal economic importance is monetary policy. So I'm glad we didn't have to talk about that today, but the tax code's a big one, and I'm glad they're going to address it.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if Congress isn't able to agree on the best way to fix every problem and eliminate every complication, then even if they can make some progress, then I think that they'll eliminate a lot of the the issues in our tax code, and that's going to be a big payoff for the American people, but also for the economy. Okay, this has been another edition of IWF's Working for Women podcast. Thank you, Hadley, for being our guest today. To our listeners, if you are interested in learning more about tax reform and other issues, please check us out at IWF.org. Thanks so much for tuning in.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, or stop by IWF.org for similar content.